At 7:12 p.m. on May 23, 1982, a neighbor in Cloverdale, California, called the local police. "She hasn't come home," the voice whispered. No alarms had sounded, no signs of struggle, just a missing 13-year-old girl walking home from a friend's house. At the time, the significance of a brief interaction Sarah had with a local man near the arcade seemed trivial, but it would later become the critical thread unraveling a decades-old deception. Sarah Geer was a bright, energetic student at Cloverdale Junior High. Cloverdale prided itself on safety, and her disappearance shocked the community. Parents, neighbors, and teachers were gripped by fear and uncertainty. That afternoon, Sarah left her friend's house and walked through familiar streets, passing the arcade where she exchanged a few words with a man. By 7 p.m., she had vanished. Her body was later discovered in a narrow alley behind an apartment complex. Biological material was carefully collected, preserved meticulously, but the technology to fully analyze it did not exist at the time. Investigators canvassed neighborhoods, interviewed witnesses, and questioned persons of interest. Small inconsistencies in neighbor reports, who saw whom and when, would later prove critical. A behavioral slip, the casual engagement with Sarah, was initially dismissed but would later reveal the suspect's overconfidence and underestimation of exposure, the first crack in a pattern that would be exposed decades later. In 2003, advances in DNA technology allowed scientists to develop a usable profile from the preserved evidence. The profile entered CODIS, the national DNA database, but yielded no match. The suspect had no criminal record, leaving the case cold once more. Careful documentation of witness statements and minor behaviors, however, preserved the thread that investigators would follow decades later. By 2021, investigative genetic genealogy offered a breakthrough. Analysts compared the old DNA profile to public genealogy databases, constructing family trees and narrowing the suspect pool. One man emerged, James Oliver Inick. Surveillance confirmed his patterns aligned with the crime scene. Weeks later, a discarded cigarette yielded DNA that matched the profile from Sarah's clothing. The casual interaction that had seemed insignificant in 1982 now revealed the subtle behavioral crack that would unravel the case. Inick's pattern of calculated control and overconfidence had guided the crime, but small, traceable actions had left a forensic signature. In court, the preserved evidence, the DNA, the genealogical links, and the cigarette all formed a coherent narrative. The jury convicted him of murder and assault, imposing life without parole. Yet the story did not end with conviction. Investigators had identified how the crime unfolded, revealing a psychological pattern of control and risk-taking that had gone unnoticed for decades. Stay with us as we examine the forensic breakthroughs in detail, reconstruct the timeline of the crime, and reveal how these behavioral and investigative insights converged to finally close the case. In 2021, decades after Sarah Geer's disappearance, investigators revisited the preserved evidence with tools unimaginable in 1982. While DNA profiling had already pointed toward James Oliver Inick, the breakthrough came from digital genealogy and advanced forensic reconstruction. Analysts were able to extract more detailed markers from the original biological material, allowing them to identify distant relatives in public databases. Each genealogical link narrowed the field of possible suspects, creating a map of family connections that ultimately singled out Inick. Investigators then focused on his movements on the day of the crime. By cross-referencing historical employment records, utility logs, and neighborhood patterns, they reconstructed his likely locations and routines. While he had been careful, subtle oversights emerged, small discrepancies in where he claimed to have been versus locations corroborated by archival neighborhood observations. These minor inconsistencies were not evidence on their own, but when aligned with the genealogical trail, they became powerful indicators of opportunity. Meanwhile, investigators discovered another critical piece of forensic evidence: trace fibers from Sarah's clothing on objects linked to Inick's household. These fibers, preserved in storage for decades, were invisible to the original investigation. Modern microscopy and chemical analysis confirmed that the fibers matched the fabric of her clothing. This finding, combined with the genealogical and DNA evidence, created a multi-layered forensic framework that tied him to both the victim and the locations she had passed through on the day of her disappearance. Behavioral analysis further clarified the suspect's actions. The timeline of his day suggested he had deliberately positioned himself along Sarah's route, exploiting predictable patterns while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. Investigators noted that he exhibited a consistent pattern of calculated observation, watching for routines, then acting during narrow windows of opportunity. The subtle cracks in his planning emerged from archival witness statements, which, when re-examined, revealed moments when he was seen near the route at unexpected times. These observations, combined with the forensic data, allowed the team to reconstruct his movements with unprecedented precision. The integration of behavioral insight with forensic science revealed a pattern that would have been nearly impossible to detect in 1982. Each small piece, genealogical matches, fiber evidence, neighborhood timelines, contributed to a comprehensive picture of both opportunity and intent. The investigators now understood not only who committed the crime, but how it unfolded, minute by minute. This part of the investigation culminated in the collection of additional physical evidence that, while overlooked for decades, now confirmed the sequence of events. Items recovered from Unique's environment were analyzed for microscopic traces, chemical residues, and contextual alignment with Sarah's last movements. Each element fit into the reconstructed timeline like pieces of a puzzle, strengthening the case and demonstrating the power of modern forensic science combined with behavioral analysis. Stay with us as we delve into the precise minute-by-minute reconstruction of the crime itself, as the investigation approached the point of arrest, highlighting how behavioral psychology and forensic evidence intersected to reveal not just the suspect's identity, but the method and sequence of his actions. By examining the patterns of control and exposure, viewers will see how decades of oversight and meticulous preservation converged to expose the hidden dynamics of this American cold case. Investigators turned their attention to reconstructing the precise sequence of the crime. With the suspect identified and the forensic links established, the challenge was to understand exactly how Sarah Geer's disappearance unfolded, the behavioral patterns, the sequence of actions, and the subtle decisions that allowed the crime to remain hidden for decades. Analysis of archival witness reports revealed that James Oliver Unique had positioned himself along routes Sarah commonly used, waiting for a moment when she would be isolated but within view of the surrounding area. Behavioral analysts noted that he demonstrated a combination of patience and opportunism, selecting a narrow window where he could act without attracting attention. The timing of these movements suggested not impulsive behavior, but careful, calculated observation, indicative of someone seeking to maintain control while minimizing risk. Investigators also examined environmental factors from that evening. Street lighting, traffic patterns, and neighborhood foot traffic were reconstructed using historical records, photographs, and maps. These details allowed them to establish where Sarah and Unique would have been at specific times, clarifying the path of the crime. Even minor elements, the sound of a passing car, the location of a shadowed alley, the angle of a streetlight, were incorporated into the reconstruction, providing context for the behavioral choices made. In addition, analysts studied Unique's previous routines and social behaviors to identify escalation patterns. He had previously demonstrated a preference for isolated locations when engaging in risky or antisocial behavior, and these tendencies aligned with the choice of location for the crime. Investigators concluded that the alley where Sarah's body was later discovered had been deliberately selected for privacy and control, while still allowing rapid exit if necessary. Forensic reconstruction also highlighted a critical psychological observation: the suspect repeatedly exhibited overconfidence in his control of the situation. Subtle behavioral indicators, such as lingering near locations before and after the event and interacting casually with passers-by, suggested he believed he could manipulate circumstances without leaving traces. Analysts described this as a pattern of invisible overreach, actions intended to maintain oversight, which paradoxically left the evidence trail that ultimately exposed him. The combination of timing, location, and behavior also revealed risk miscalculations. Unique underestimated the potential for observation from peripheral witnesses, and overlooked microtraces left in the environment, including impressions, fibers, and disturbances that were later documented during forensic re-examination. While these clues had gone unnoticed in the initial investigation, modern analysis highlighted how minor environmental interactions had unintentionally provided investigators with a framework to reconstruct the crime. By carefully integrating these behavioral and environmental data points, investigators could recreate a timeline of the event, minute by minute. They could predict where the suspect had been before Sarah's disappearance, where she had been intercepted, and the likely sequence of movements leading to the location where the crime concluded. This level of reconstruction transformed the case from one of identity and connection into a detailed portrait of method and intent. This investigation demonstrated the value of psychologically informed forensic analysis. By examining patterns of control, situational risk, and escalation, investigators revealed how the crime unfolded, not just who committed it. It also highlighted the interplay between behavior and opportunity, how carefully planned actions, combined with overconfidence, created the conditions for both the crime and its eventual exposure. In the next part of this investigation, we will move into the courtroom, where this intricate reconstruction, integrating behavior, timing, and environmental context, was presented as evidence. The jury would see not just the identity of the perpetrator, but the deliberate sequence of actions that defined the crime, providing insight into the psychological dynamics that allowed it to occur and ultimately be solved. The courtroom was silent as the case of Sarah Geer entered its final chapter. For decades, investigators had painstakingly reconstructed the crime, but now it was up to the legal system to translate that reconstruction into justice. From opening statements to the final verdict, every argument hinged not only on evidence, but on the careful explanation of patterns, behaviors, and sequences that the jury had never witnessed firsthand. The prosecution built its case around the integration of investigative insights. They presented a reconstructed timeline of the suspect's day, highlighting movements and choices with precision. Maps, diagrams, and timestamped records showed how each decision aligned with the ultimate opportunity for the crime. Rather than relying solely on sensationalized details, they focused on logic, behavior, and forensic alignment, allowing the jury to see the chain of actions that led to the offense. During testimony, forensic analysts explained how minor environmental disturbances, fiber transfers, and observational inconsistencies contributed to understanding the sequence of events. Behavioral experts described patterns of control, risk assessment, and overconfidence, demonstrating how these traits influenced the suspect's actions. The jury could follow the reasoning step by step, seeing the connections between decisions, opportunity, and exposure. The defense attempted to challenge the narrative, questioning the interpretation of reconstructed movements and the psychological conclusions drawn by analysts. They suggested alternative explanations for certain behaviors and emphasized that reconstructed sequences were inferential. However, the prosecution countered by showing converging evidence from multiple disciplines, environmental patterns, behavioral psychology, and minute forensic indicators, all supporting a coherent narrative of intent and opportunity. As closing arguments approached, the courtroom focus shifted to cumulative reasoning. Prosecutors emphasized the integration of evidence across timelines, behaviors, and locations. The narrative was not about isolated facts, but about a comprehensive picture of planning, risk, and exposure. Jurors were invited to consider not just the physical evidence, but the logic of the suspect's actions, how control and overconfidence, observed and reconstructed, led to the crime. During deliberation, jurors examined the interplay of behavioral and forensic evidence. They discussed the plausibility of the reconstructed sequence, the credibility of expert analysis, and the alignment of environmental and situational data. The pattern of deliberate choices, carefully reconstructed and corroborated, weighed heavily. Ultimately, the jury concluded that the evidence demonstrated clear intent, opportunity, and accountability. The verdict was pronounced guilty on all counts. Life without parole was imposed, a legal closure to a case that had spanned decades. Yet the significance went beyond the sentence. This case illustrated the power of integrated investigative methodology, how forensic analysis, behavioral insight, and environmental reconstruction could combine to solve a crime long thought unsolvable. Reflecting on the proceedings, investigators and analysts noted that the case demonstrated several critical principles for future cold cases: the importance of preserving subtle behavioral observations, the value of cross-disciplinary forensic approaches, and the necessity of reconstructing not just evidence, but the patterns of human behavior that make crimes possible. As the courtroom emptied, one question lingered: for investigators, legal professionals, and the public alike, in complex cases, how much weight should be given to reconstructed behavioral patterns alongside hard evidence? Could the same methodology prevent future cold cases from remaining unsolved? Sarah Geer's story had been told in fragments across decades, but through methodical investigation, integrated science, and careful analysis of human behavior, the full narrative had finally emerged. It is a reminder that even in long cold American cases, justice can be achieved when insight, precision, and perseverance converge. Thanks for watching.